You probably bought a Hershey's, a Lindt, or maybe a bag of Nestle Toll House chocolate chips, thinking it was just a sweet treat. But what if those familiar brands, sold in Costco, Walmart, Target, and grocery chains across the U.S., are hiding risks no one warned you about? Recent FDA reports and Consumer Reports tests found dangerous levels of lead and cadmium in popular chocolate bars, the same ones children snack on every day. Behind the shiny wrappers, there are questions of food, safety, contamination, and even sanitation failures that could directly affect your health. What's really inside your chocolate? Part 1. Sweetness turned toxic. The diagnosis. However, before we name brands, we have to name the metals, because lead and cadmium do not appear by magic. Cocoa trees take up cadmium from mineral-rich soils in West Africa, while lead dust can cling to beans during drying and transport before processing concentrates both. Meanwhile, each step in the supply chain can raise the load or keep it low through controls, audits, and cleaner practices. And what do they do inside you? Even so, the damage depends on who you are and how often you eat, because lead targets the nervous system while cadmium punishes kidneys and bones. For children and teens, even tiny lead doses can nudge learning and attention off course. For older adults, cadmium accelerates bone demineralization and stresses renal function. As a consequence of this, a square after dinner stops being harmless when the numbers stack week after week. Numbers tell a harder truth. By the way, you'll never know what's really hidden in your plate at chains like these. Subscribe now and protect yourself before your next bite. Meanwhile, benchmarks exist to translate fear into thresholds, and those thresholds are not rumors. California's Prop 65 daily levels flag lead exposures down near microgram territory and cadmium in similarly strict bands, while European Union caps add a second yardstick that many Americans never see. However, the labels rarely show these lines, which leaves trust to do the heavy lifting at checkout. Which brands cross the line? What many did not see coming is how quickly an American classic found itself on a list, because in February 2025, the Environmental Working Group highlighted Ghirardelli Intense Dark 86% with about 0.88 micrograms of cadmium per serving, above Prop 65 and brushing EU limits. Meanwhile, the mood flipped from postcard nostalgia to Not My Ghirardelli as clips of palate destruction circulated. As a consequence of this, the gold-embossed promise looked thinner than foil, luxury foil, harsher reality. However, premium branding offered no shield in January 2025, when Consumer Reports ranked Lindt Excellence 85% among the worst for cadmium at roughly 0.96 micrograms per serving. The bar that plays like a silk tie became a case study in how price cannot purchase purity without proof. Meanwhile, shoppers who gifted those squares for health benefits felt the irony land with a thud. Gift box, hidden cost. Even so, the neighborly grin on Hershey's packaging could not quiet February's lab numbers, because Consumer Reports measured lead near 0.9 micrograms and cadmium around 0.7 micrograms per serving in flagship bars. As a consequence of this, nostalgia had to sit beside data at the kitchen table while parents rethought lunchboxes and midnight snacks. Meanwhile, Century Brands learned that memory bends when measurement arrives. Nostalgia meets lab results. However, the shock hit hardest in the baking aisle when the FDA in April 2025 flagged Nestle Toll House dark chocolate chips with average lead around 1.05 micrograms per serving. A kitchen staple turned into a bitter pill as grandparents confessed guilt over trays of cookies that suddenly tasted like doubt. Meanwhile, the lesson grew simple and sharp. Kitchen staple, bitter pill. Even so, the trouble did not stop at homey logos, because independent testing in February 2025 tied Mars's Dove Dark to about 1.0 micrograms of lead per serving, with cadmium contamination layered on top. As a consequence of this, a portfolio aimed at children and family fun had to answer adult questions about toxic burdens. Meanwhile, candy-colored branding looked oddly pale under lab lights, marketed to kids too. However, festivity also met a ledger when Italian advocates in February 2025 reported Ferrero Rocher dark truffles around 0.85 micrograms of cadmium per serving. Kinder Joy dimmed as inspectors in other countries echoed concerns, proving that holiday glow cannot outshine numbers. Meanwhile, parents who once stuffed eggs in stockings hesitated at the shelf, even the festive ones. Even so, a quick verbal grid helps anchor the scope without drowning you in charts because Ghirardelli, Lindt, Hershey's, Nestlé, Mars, and Ferrero each tripped Prop 65 exposure lines on lead, cadmium, or both, while several flirted with or surpassed EU thresholds. As a consequence of this, the question shifts from isolated bad actors to a pattern large enough to be called a market. Meanwhile, patterns invite pressure from places brands cannot ignore. Regulators start knocking next. However, when numbers cross lines, courtrooms and customs posts wake up, and the timeline from January to June 2025 reads like a drumline of notices, lawsuits, restrictions, and outright bans across states and European capitals. Meanwhile, retailers and governments began asking for proof instead of promises, pushing companies to show current lab results rather than polished statements. As a consequence of this, the shiny wrapper finally met its invoice in public. Follow the crackdowns. Part 2. Broken supply chains, forests, labor, and the price of cheap. However, the numbers from the lab only tell half the story because the rest is written in soil, smoke, and silence across the equator. Deforestation and child labor don't show up on a nutrition label, yet they stain the bite more deeply than sugar ever could. Meanwhile, the cocoa belt from Ghana to Brazil carries the true debt of our dessert, paid by people we never meet for prices we brag about. Logos hide landscapes. Even so, the map grows specific the moment we trace supply to deeds, because in April 2025, Bloomberg detailed thousands of acres in Ghana cleared to feed premium pipelines tied to Lindt and, by extension, Ghirardelli. Satellite images didn't blink at PR lines. Boundaries of protected forest reappeared as stumps and new rows of cocoa. As a consequence of this, a velvet brand voice suddenly sounded like a chainsaw. Cleared forests, cleared consciences. However, the cuts in the canopy are matched by cuts in childhood, and March 2025 brought the Guardian's on-the-ground reporting of kids working barefoot, spraying pesticides for Lindt-linked suppliers. Toxicologists call unprotected spraying a slow theft of breath, skin, and years, yet it travels under the word seasonal like weather. Meanwhile, the health risk doesn't begin at the bar. It starts at the farm gate. Health risks start on farms. Even so, the violence of speed turns blunt in other fields because Reuters in March 2025 recorded West African boys hauling 100-pound cocoa sacks for Hershey suppliers, beatings delivered when bodies lagged behind quotas. As a consequence of this, sweetness gains a second ingredient you cannot taste but you can name: force. Meanwhile, the list of household brands and household injuries keeps overlapping. Sweetness built on suffering. However, the tree line tells another truth when you follow Mars across maps, since NGO investigations showed protected corridors in Ghana shaved into patchwork to expand supply. Satellites are good witnesses. They remember every acre. Meanwhile, fund-size slogans feel smaller when forest size shrinks too. Supply mapped by satellites. Even so, festive packaging cannot erase a ledger of labor. In April 2025, reporting tied Ferrero's indirect suppliers in Cameroon to kids earning less than $1 a day while handling hazardous tasks. As a consequence of this, a gold sphere on a silver tray begins to look like a coin struck from someone else's childhood. Meanwhile, the wrapper shines more brightly than the truth beneath it. The cost hidden in foil. However, the distance flips west when Reuters in May 2025 documented debt bondage on Brazilian cocoa tied to Nestlé's chain, with workers living in sheds that failed the word shelter, while wages hovered near $2 a day. Debt as a harness turns a season into a sentence the body must serve. Meanwhile, family branding keeps smiling in grocery aisles. Family image, factory reality. Even so, the question behind every scandal is why now, and the arithmetic answers coldly, because cocoa prices climbed around 40% from late 2024, hitting 14-year highs as climate hammered Ghana and Ivory Coast. As a consequence of this, spreadsheets demanded miracles, and managers found shortcuts that looked like survival until auditors arrived. Meanwhile, the bill for cheap gets itemized eventually. Shareholders versus safety. However, when pressure rises, language gets creative, and label theater steps on stage with words like sustainable, responsibly sourced, and ethical cocoa that rarely include a PDF of audited lots. Proof is heavy. It doesn't float like adjectives. Meanwhile, the motif returns because it must. Demand proof, not prose. Even so, brands rarely travel alone. They hitch a ride on our memories, and nostalgia turns into camouflage at the point of sale. One Illinois customer's line about trusting Ghirardelli like a church bake sale says more about purchasing than 100 price tags. As a consequence of this, our own comfort becomes part of the supply chain, softening the hard edges of harm. Meanwhile, that comfort is what companies count on. Numbers over nostalgia. However, if this pattern feels familiar, it should. Because when we pulled apart rock-bottom grocery bargains in the Aldi deep dive, the hidden tax arrived later as quality drift and quiet recalls. Cheap wasn't cheap, it was deferred. Meanwhile, chocolate is playing the same tune on new instruments, and the key change is only the geography. Bargains carry a bill. Even so, pressure does move mountains when it comes with badges and borders, and regulators can turn marketing into math without raising their voices. Prop 65 notices, EU heavy metal limits, and custom seizures do not argue, they tally and act. As a consequence of this, a slogan can lose a country overnight. Meanwhile, executives learn to pronounce microgram with perfect diction. See the crackdowns unfold. However, policy is a theory until it meets the dock, so the next chapter catalogs the concrete. Lawsuits filed, imports restricted, pallets destroyed, and press releases that break like thin sugar shells. Country by country, brand by brand, consequence by consequence, the ledger is about to be read aloud. Meanwhile, a market long shielded by habit will face a calendar and a courtroom. Names, dates, consequences. Even so, before the gavel falls, remember the three motifs guiding our line of sight, because shiny wrappers still hide costs, nostalgia still dissolves in numbers, and promises still collapse without proof. As a consequence of this, the most useful stories ahead won't be outrages, but outcomes you can track and cite. Meanwhile, the stage lights shift from fields to filings, from soil to subpoenas. However, outcomes only bite if we understand the sequence, and 2025 gave us a tight arc worth tracing from January tests to June bans with each action stacked on an earlier omission. That is where accountability finally grows teeth, and that is where we turn next with the same calm insistence we brought to the lab. Meanwhile, the door to enforcement is already cracking open. The docket is waiting. Part 3. Crackdowns and courtrooms. When trust meets enforcement. However, the docket didn't wait long, because from January to June 2025, the calendar itself became a hammer. January brought Consumer Reports cadmium tables. February stacked EWG and advocacy screenings. April delivered FDA notices and EU thresholds, and June closed with outright bans. Meanwhile, the arc felt less like headlines and more like an audit arriving room by room. From lab to lawsuit. By the way, without subscribing, the next time you sit down at a chain restaurant, you'll have no idea what risks are riding on that fork. Subscribe today, or keep eating in the dark. Even so, the first gavel echo many heard came from Illinois, where a complaint against Ghirardelli argued that phrases like crafted with care misled buyers, while Intense Dark 86% averaged about 0.88 micrograms of cadmium per serving. As a consequence of this, marketing copy turned into evidence, and nostalgia turned into a witness that couldn't hold up. Marketing on trial. However, century-old reputations offered no perjury shield, and March 2025 saw a New York filing accusing Hershey's of hiding toxic risk, while Consumer Reports measured roughly 0.9 micrograms of lead and 0.7 micrograms of cadmium in flagship bars. Meanwhile, the neighborly brand voice had to pronounce microgram in front of a judge. Century brands, modern charges. Even so, luxury logos faced their own deposition because a Florida suit named Godiva after lab findings pegged select dark products near 1.1 micrograms of lead per serving, and a retiree linked daily consumption to kidney trouble. As a consequence of this, the velvet ad tone met the cold math of medical records. Luxury meets liability. However, courtrooms were only half the arena, and ports became the other half when customs agents started reading numbers like stop signs. April 2025 brought EU dark chocolate import bans hitting Hershey's SKUs after cadmium and pesticide screens failed safer caps. Meanwhile, pallets meant for shelves migrated to secure cages. Borders close, shelves empty. Even so, the gold and ribbon aisle didn't glide past inspectors either, because Norway and Denmark flagged Lindt for cadmium exceedances under tightened guidance, while Ferrero's festive lines drew scrutiny from additional EU checks. As a consequence of this gift season, staples learned compliance seasons arrive earlier each year. Gold foil, red flags. However, the hardest lesson for kitchen staples landed in June when France and Belgium issued advisories and bans covering several Nestlé dark chocolate products after lead and cadmium thresholds wouldn't clear European math. Meanwhile, shoppers watched clerks pull familiar bags from hooks that had held them for decades when Europe says no. Even so, the family fun aisle took a bruise of its own when the EU suspended certain Mars items, including Dove Dark and country-specific Snickers Dark lines, pending remediation and retesting. As a consequence of this, colorful mascots met grayscale compliance forms, kids' brands under fire. However, the most surprising thing was how quickly the street spoke, because hashtags carried more weight than focus groups. Just Not My Ghirardelli trended beside clips of German officials destroying seized stock. As betrayal surged as videos showed clerks yanking Nestlé bars from checkout lanes. Meanwhile, TikTok timelines filled with foil crumpling like confessions. Retailers feel the heat. Even so, retail didn't just film the storm, it moved inventory and risk. Chains posted precautionary signs, adjusted planograms, and asked suppliers for current 2025 lab PDFs instead of press statements. As a consequence of this, shelf space became a negotiation measured in parts per million. What should consumers do? However, consumers needed a triage they could use today, so the filter got simple and strict. Look for brands that publish 2025 heavy metal results by product and lot, state origin down to region, and explain remediation if they fail a test. Meanwhile, anything without proof gets treated like a promise on credit. But which names qualify? Even so, the answer doesn't end with a list because the bridge out of scandal must carry weight. Independent testing cadence, transparent supply maps, and direct trade programs with audit trails you can open, not admire. As a consequence of this, solutions stop being slogans and start being files you can read and recipes you can control. Rebuild trust on proof. However, before we cross that bridge, the pattern we traced in the Aldi deep dive flickers again, because low shelf prices bought with hidden shortcuts always send a second invoice in health or ethics. Meanwhile, the meat chain playbook we exposed, industrial shortcuts sold as fresh, echoes in chocolate with different uniforms. Patterns repeat everywhere. Even so, enforcement only sets the floor. Consumers decide the ceiling, and the next act is about strategy that works without waiting for another notice. As a consequence of this, we turn from courtrooms to kitchens and from ports to pantries, outlining a playbook that makes sweet honest again. Act with a plan. Part 4. Rebuild or Boycott, a consumer playbook that actually works. However, outrage alone doesn't change dinner, so the choice now is whether we keep buying the wrapper or start buying the numbers behind it. Health, ethics, and enforcement have already converged this year, which means habit is the only thing left to move. Meanwhile, a plan beats a panic because plans survive the next headline and the next shelf reset. Act with a plan. Even so, the first step is simple and stubborn because safer options exist and they post receipts instead of slogans. Alter, Eco, Ritual, Dandelion, French Broad, Ask a Nosy, Equal Exchange, Tony's Chocolonely, and Pasha for chips have published 2025 heavy metal results by product line. As a consequence of this, proof becomes part of the flavor, and trust stops being blind. Proof beats promises. However, brand names are only the doorway. The room you need to check is the lab data. Look for PDFs dated in 2025 showing micrograms per serving for lead and cadmium, the independent laboratory's name, and the method's detection limits. so the zeros actually mean 0. Meanwhile, lot specificity matters because one safe batch does not sanctify the next one. Ask for the lot. Even so, some labels will try to drown you in adjectives, which is why Tony's and Equal Exchange are useful examples when they publish traceable maps and farm programs alongside their tests. Direct trade isn't a poem when it arrives with coordinates, timelines, and remediation budgets measured in dollars. As a consequence of this, the supply chain stops being mystical and starts being mappable. Maps beat metaphors. However, baking demands its own fix, and chips sit right where children reach first, so choose lines like Pasha Organic Chocolate Chips that posted 2025 results below Proposition 65 exposure bands. Keep the per-serving math visible on your phone and use it like a speedometer while you shop. Meanwhile, home recipes let you control dosage with your measuring spoon. Kitchen math saves families. Even so, you can skip the aisle altogether by going DIY, melting fair trade cocoa butter, whisking in low-reading cocoa powder, and sweetening with honey, maple, or dates. Add toasted nuts, sea salt, or orange zest, then portion into small molds so a serving is exactly what you intend it to be. As a consequence of this, the ingredient list becomes a sentence you wrote. Control every ingredient. However, not everyone wants to temper chocolate on a Tuesday, so learn to read labels like an auditor, even when you buy pre-made. Hunt for a harvest or origin statement, an explicit testing date in 2025, and a QR code that resolves to actual lab results rather than a lifestyle blog page. Meanwhile, if the code stalls or the numbers are missing, you just got your answer. No proof, no purchase. Even so, brands listen when silence costs them, which is why one short email can be worth a dozen comments. Ask for 3 specifics in writing. Current 2025 micrograms per serving results by SKU, and lot, the corrective steps taken if any failures occurred, and a list of supplier countries with anti-deforestation and child labor audits attached. As a consequence of this, a non-answer becomes a decision tool. Make silence costly. However, the price story we uncovered in the Aldi deep dive still holds, because bargains that dodge quality controls always charge interest later in recalls, doctor visits, or damage done far from the register. Rock bottom tags often hide rock bottom oversight, and the installment plan is paid by strangers and your future self. Meanwhile, chocolate isn't exempt from arithmetic. Cheap has a second bill. Even so, the meat chain playbook we exposed echoes here with different uniforms, because fresh was often code for reassembled, and crafted often meant centrally portioned. Marketing airbrushes process until the mirror fogs, then invites you to trust the reflection. As a consequence of this, numbers become the only cloth that doesn't shrink in hot water. Patterns repeat everywhere. However, pressure works best when it's aimed where companies feel it, and 3 levers have already proven their weight: import restrictions, retailer delistings, and shareholder resolutions that tie executive pay to verified safety metrics. Meanwhile, none of these require a megaphone if consumers keep asking the same boring questions in large enough numbers. Target the leverage. Even so, companies need a runway to fix what they broke, and the checklist isn't magic, it's maintenance. Post quarterly heavy metal tests per SKU, prune suppliers that miss thresholds twice, fund child labor remediation with independent partners, and publish deforestation-free evidence using satellite monitoring and third-party audits. As a consequence of this, the press release becomes a progress log. Don't accept slogans. However, rebuilding trust is easier when the seal lives on the product, so ask for lot-level QR codes that open to the exact lab report for the chocolate in your hand. Add the lab's phone number and the date the sample was pulled, not just when it was posted. Meanwhile, a 10-second scan becomes the new ritual before a bite. Make them earn it. Even so, not every household needs the same route, which is why we end with 3 tracks you can actually follow. Track 1, proof first brands with 2025 PDFs and origin clarity. Track 2, the blended approach of buying those brands and supplementing with simple home bark or chips. Track 3, a temporary boycott of any brand that won't show numbers by lot. As a consequence of this, agency returns to the plate. Choose your track. However, the emotional work matters too, because nostalgia doesn't vanish just because a chart told it to, and comfort isn't the enemy when comfort is honest. Replace the gold foil habit with a new one that tastes like trust and reads like a receipt. Meanwhile, the sweetness you keep will be the sweetness you checked. Sweet can be honest. Even so, the story doesn't close on outrage or fear. It closes on competence practiced over time, where families and shoppers evolve from passengers to pilots, numbers over nostalgia, proof over promises, and the clear understanding that a shiny wrapper without data is just a costume. As a consequence of this, the next bite can feel simple again. The choice writes the label.